rich, beautiful, black, and condemned to the electric chair. Welcome to another great episode of Royal Black and Elite. I'm Lady Trinette Wilson, and I am your lecturer and social historian. Here I am. We had a conference not long ago, and we were able to participate with some African dancers who taught us how to dance and play the instrument. So it was a lot of fun. And today's episode is going to be very interesting. I say it's interesting because I've never heard of this woman ever. She was one of Florida's wealthiest women, and she went through one of the most sensational trials in American history. Her name is Ruby McCollum. Let's get into it. Ruby was the second of six siblings, and she was born in 1909 to William and Gertrude Jackson. Her parents, they recognized early that Ruby was extremely smart. But in Florida, there was a lot of racism and discrimination. And so though the schools were segregated at the time, her parents, they paid to enroll her in a private school because she was so smart. And when she enrolled, she excelled in accounting. Perhaps that was an indication of all the money she would count that she would make later in her life. By 1931, she was married. She married a man named Sam McCollum. Now, after she and Sam were married, they relocated to Nyack, New York. You see, Florida was very racist during the time, as I mentioned earlier, and also during that time, there was something called the Great Migration. So there were black people, millions of them, who were moving from the South to the North to try to get away from the racism. And they had three children. They had one boy, his name was Sam Jr. They had two girls, one was named Sonia and one was named Kay. Now, Ruby also had a fourth child, and her name was Loretta. And Loretta was the catalyst for what would become the crime of the century, as she was a biracial little girl, and clearly not Sam's child. And we see a picture here of the beautiful little girl, Loretta, and the reason why Ruby was facing the electric chair. Now, Ruby, they didn't stay very long in New York. They did move back to Florida. And what drove them back really was Sam's brother. Now, his name was Buck. And Buck was making a lot of money, running a gambling business. So they moved back in 1934. Sam, when he moved back, he jumped right in, feet first, into the gambling business, and he took it a step further, and he was involved with liquor sales. Now, both were illegal, but they were making a lot of money, and the crooked cops, all they had to do was pass them a little money, and that none was the wiser. So that's how they made their money. They became very, very wealthy. They ran a few legal businesses as well. They sold burial plots, and they ran a funeral home. So by the 40s and the 50s, the McCullens were extremely wealthy, and they owned a two-story home in Live Oak, Florida. They also owned this hall you see here, and so that's where a lot of the parties would take place, and that place was also on the Chitlin Circuit. So many of the people who traveled on the Chitlin Circuit stopped there as well. They owned juke joints, several of them, throughout the city. And it was said that Ruby, well, she drove a brand new Chrysler car every single time one came out. So they really lived a very fast and loose life. But that fast and loose life also led to Ruby becoming a heroin addict. Now, the family still tried to remain, have an air of a little bit of credibility and morality. And so they would donate a lot of money to the church. So the community thought they were great people, but they were doing some illegal stuff behind the scenes. Her wealth and status allowed her to go see a doctor, not just any doctor, one of the most prominent white doctors in the city. His name was Dr. C. Leroy Adams. Now, Dr. Adams was also a senator-elect, so he had his eye on the governor's office. But that wasn't all that Dr. Adams had his eye on. He also had his eye on Ruby, or so Ruby alleges. In fact, Ruby alleges that Dr. Adams abused her for many years. Not only abused her at his office, but also in her home when her husband was away on long trips away for work. Now, this relationship was, well, this abuse. It wasn't a relationship, as alleged by Ruby. It was an abusive relationship, and it came to a boil one day when Ruby decided to get in her car with her two children, and she was packed. She drove to the doctor's office where she said they got into an altercation. Now, what was the altercation about? Ruby was pregnant again. So not only had she gotten pregnant with Loretta, who was allegedly Dr. Adams, but she was pregnant again. And she didn't want to be with this man. She alleged this man was abusing her. And she said they got into a tussle. Now, the tussle ended with the doctor laying on the floor, pumped with 4 bullets. And of course, she was arrested right away. Now, when she was arrested, she was trying to plead her case. They put her in jail, and her husband, Sam, he died of a heart attack one day after her arrest. And this was in 1952. He took the children to Ruby's mother's home, as they went through this trial. And can you believe it? He passed away from a heart attack the very next day. So she had to go through this by herself. She was easily convicted. It was an all-white kangaroo court. The judge was one of Adams' pallbearers at the funeral, and he would not allow Ruby's lawyer to introduce any of the alleged abuse. The famed writer and anthropologist Zora Neale Hurst, well, she was on assignment from the Pittsburgh Carrier, and she covered the trial. And it brought attention to Ruby's unfair treatment, and that's really how it really grew national fame because of Zora. So thanks to Zora, Ruby's story has been able to be told. When she took the stand, she was not allowed to tell her story. In fact, the judge upheld 380 objections on the part of the prosecutor. I think the only court trial that had more objections was Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. In fact, her lawyer turned around. Ruby's lawyer turned around and told the judge, quote unquote, reportedly, "May God forgive you, Judge Adams, for robbing a human being of life in such a fashion." She was convicted on December 20th, 1952. And the news articles was really brutal. They wanted to see her in jail. They splashed her face. They splashed her baby all on the front of their newspapers. Meanwhile, she was losing her wealth because she had to pay for the lawyers and the court trials and everything she was going through. Thankfully, though, in 1954, because of this miscarriage of justice, the Florida Supreme Court actually overturned her conviction on a technicality. Now, during the second trial, her defense attorney, he had a different approach. While visiting her there at the jail, he noticed that she was suffering from some mental illness. The stress had really gotten to her. So he petitioned for her to be put into a mental institution versus being put into prison. And so that's where she was. She spent many years there until 1974, when her lawyer was able to have her released under the Baker Act. And that was a newly passed law that Florida passed that allowed mental patients to be freed if they showed they were no threat to themselves or the community. After her release, Ruby lived out the rest of her life in a rest home in Silver Springs, Florida. An author, his name was William Bradford Huey. He wrote a best-selling book, Woman in the Swansea Jail, in 1956. Because of the money that he made from the book, he left Ruby a trust fund, and that is how she was actually able to pay for her stay at the rehabilitation center. And this is where she passed away on May 23rd, 1992. She died of a stroke at 82 years old. Now, her children, unfortunately, 2 of them passed even before she did. In 1978, her daughter Kay died in a car accident. and her daughter Sonia died 1 year later in 1979. Not much is known what happened to Loretta. Her son Sam actually also, he was arrested in 1975 for gambling. And they took a significant portion of their homestead, almost $250,000 out of their home. Now, there have been some documentaries and some movies on this. So if you've never heard this story, there are documentaries out there, but I wanted to share it here. Had you ever heard of Ruby McCollum? Had you ever heard of this wealthy Black woman who was sentenced to the electric chair, but really spent the majority of her life in an insane asylum? And she lost her wealth in the process. Ruby lost everything, and even some say her mental health. And this story is so just powerful and poignant that a woman who had reported being abused, had to go through what she went through. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. As always, I truly appreciate you logging in, liking, sharing, subscribing, telling your friends about it, and leave me a comment. Had you ever heard of this woman? Do you think Ruby meant to kill him? I want to thank you for watching, and I'll see you on another great episode of Royal, Black, and Elite.